In the previous lecture, we introduced American civil religion as it's been understood by history and by contemporary scholarship, and tried to get at this more or less extra-institutional collection or cluster of beliefs and rituals and symbols that in fact do function as, something of a unifying force within the national culture of the United States, that in fact do serve as something of a public morality. It's difficult to imagine contemporary America as unified meaningfully around really anything. Um, as a nation, we're currently more polarized than we have been since the Civil War. There's some different graphic representations of that. You can find more. That was a civil war. Right? You have to remember that it was a political polarization that led to years of openly martial action, to the single most destructive war in American history in terms of both American lives lost and American landscapes destroyed. So it's an extraordinarily low bar in terms of getting along, of being capable of engaging in authentic civil discourse, in political or social or moral disagreement that nonetheless orients itself towards productive work in the interest of shared goals. Each of you can consider what grade you would give America right now in the topic of civil discourse, and reasonable people might disagree with this. There are certainly arguments to be made from a variety of positions, and arguments to be made against, for instance, my own view. But in my estimation, if I were to give America a grade right now on civil discourse, I'd give us a hard F. Just a failing grade. And it's not even the sort of 0%, doesn't even have that albeit really terrible excuse of just not showing up, so not having been measured. It's more like a 20%. Americans are showing up. They're engaging across one or another disputed line, but again, in my estimation, they're doing a remarkably poor job of it. We, the people, are doing a remarkably poor job of it. Some better than others for sure, but on the whole, just really subpar. And why does that matter? Why should we care? Well, as we saw last time, de Tocqueville would suggest that the capacity for civic discourse, the degree to which the nation shares a public morality that can tether each differing constituency to a shared sense of the future, that capacity goes a long way toward shaping the political plausibility of the nation. Goes a long way to determining the health of the state. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, must openly agree on certain principles. We must identify those principles, and we must, strive to act according to those principles. We have them. I've been quoting here from the preamble. You will have noticed, but I'd suggest that those principles make infrequent appearance in our attempts at civil discourse, at building, organizing, and reshaping the political and civic institutions of the nation. There's very little upon which Americans agree as a nation. First principles have a tendency to get in the way of our disagreements, and so they are, in our day, most often just left alone, right? What are those first principles? What are the truths we hold to be self-evident? They get in the way of our arguments. Sometimes they're shunted to the margins. Sometimes they show up in academia, in college classes, rarely even that. The single truly, functionally nonpartisan issue that I can think of today, and if you think of another, you please let me know. But I'll suggest here that the single nonpartisan issue in America, in American politics today, and maybe since 1991, I'll throw a year out there, is the United States military, the United States Armed Forces. We might argue about healthcare, we might argue about education or taxes or corporate personhood or social safety nets or the role of police or gender equality or racial justice or whether or not to add fluoride to the water. But in my adult life, I have never seen a politician hesitate or equivocate in their support for the armed forces of the United States. We have been at war for an uninterrupted 20 years. Now. It's the longest single-running war in our nation's history. And I've seen no significant anti-war movement, not on college campuses, not in neighborhoods, not in Congress, certainly not anywhere near the White House or the Pentagon. To be anti-war, to be seen, therefore, as anti-military, is political suicide on both sides of any imagined aisle or actual aisle. The role of the American Armed Forces is central to and critical in late 20th and early 20th century American civil religion. And to be clear, this isn't a normative judgment. It's a functional observation. I'm not trying to make a point one way or the other about the way things ought to be. I'm just trying to make us more aware of the way things are. We closed the last lecture by looking at the cultural ritual of the national anthem. But what we skirted over was the martial nature of the song itself and its presentation. The song itself describes a scene of war. The attack on Fort McHenry that took place during the War of 1812, which some historians refer to as America's Second War for Independence. And a scene in the song, the scene described as a scene whose backdrop is lighted by the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, right? It's lighted by artillery. In America, in today's America, the song is, in its highest ritual moments, sung against a backdrop of celebratory, simulated artillery, of fireworks, which are meant to mimic bombs, mortars, artillery. It's also, in its highest ritual moments, sung against a backdrop of military personnel and colors, or flags. And at events as central to the nation's shared culture as is the Super Bowl, on your bottom left, also top left, the song is accompanied, usually closed, by a synchronized flyover of fighter jets, of aerial weaponry. Bottom left is Lady Gaga singing it some years back. Top left is Demi Lovato, whom we saw last time, but we did cut out the armed forces last time. The military, the personnel, the symbols, the equipment is center stage in the most ritualized moments of American civil religion. America supports its troops, right? There's any number of similar stickers or campaigns that you can pull off the internet with an easy search. War memorials are an important and enduring part of the nation's sacred landscape, and you see bottom middle the statue commemorating the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima. We could spend an entire lecture or an entire class looking at that, looking at the ways in which war memorials express changing social mores and a changing sense of national self-understanding. Would be an interesting class. But I'd like rather to move on here to the armed services themselves and to look briefly at the branches of the military from the inside, to the degree to which we're able to do that here. And it is more difficult for generations coming of age in the early 21st century than it has been for previous generations. And there are reasons for that. Less than 1% of the nation's population serves in the armed forces, serves in the military, and since Nixon ended the draft and instituted what's come to be known as the All-Volunteer Force, or AVF, in 1973, the military and civilian communities of America have been increasingly isolated from one another. World War II veterans are mostly gone. Vietnam veterans are dying. And with them, American families are, statistically speaking, losing a direct familial connection to military service. That less than 1% who serve also tend to do so for longer periods, encouraged by re-enlistment bonuses and pressed upon by mandates like the stop-loss program. That the military population serves for longer means that for more years on average, military personnel and their families are isolated from civilian communities. So, altogether, this means fewer Americans grow up with a dad or a mom, a brother or a sister, an aunt or an uncle who's in the service, and also fewer Americans grow up with a grandma or a grandpa, a neighbor, or a teacher who was in the service. So Americans support their troops, and from there there's a mythic slippage, more or less intentional, more or less self-aware, more or less considered, the mythic slippage from supporting troops to supporting war. Americans support their troops, and Americans support war. But on the whole, Americans don't serve. So why is the military central to the civil religion shared by shared more or less by the 99% who don't serve? And we can talk about that in terms of American exceptionalism, as we did last time, about exceptionalism's martial mandate. We can talk about it in terms of America's mythic history, its enacted belief through political action, international relations, social justice movements, popular culture like film and television, its enacted belief in redemptive violence, Here I'd like to talk about it in terms of moral communities. When we think about moral communities in the context of traditional religion, we think about churches and temples. We think about sanghas and ummas, right? It's sort of the classic, we understand these to be moral communities, right? In the context of American civil religions, we can think about moral communities in the context of benevolent associations, like the Lions or the Masons or the Elks or the Kiwanis. There's others, the Optimists, they go on. Keep going. Those are falling out of fashion. Their enrollment numbers are dropping, and they're having a harder time, getting recruits, which is a different topic, which would also make an interesting lecture or even class. We could also think about moral communities in the context maybe more alive in the younger generations, the context of social justice movements, right? Think about advocates for Black Lives Matter or gender rights or one or the other side of the abortion debate, either side, right? As members of a moral community. All of these moral communities participate in American civil religion, but none of them is central to American civil religion. Now, each of the armed forces is, in its own intentional way, a moral community. Each one understands itself in terms of the nation's civil society, orienting itself through an explicit set of values to the beliefs, symbols, and rituals of the nation. Really understanding American civil religion, which is our goal here, which again, the armed services stand at the center of, should mean understanding a little bit about the moral communities cultivated by those branches themselves, which again, stand at the center of American civil religion. There are 6 branches of the United States military. We'll start with the oldest. The United States Army was founded June 14th, 1775, as the Continental Army with George Washington as its commander. To fight in the Revolution. Like the Navy and the Marines, the Army is older than the nation itself. It's the largest branch. It's the primary land force of the U.S. military. Besides the regular Army, it has a National Guard and Reserve force. And the Army's 7 core values are listed here: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. The core values are, the Army's own website tells us, what being a soldier is all about. And they each get a description on the page that on the page on the Army's own website. They each get a paragraph, and that page is full of words like belief, faith, true faith, allegiance, devotion, morals, and along with the titles themselves: honor, loyalty, duty, courage, right? These words are at home. They're at home in the larger, in the language of religious belief and practice. This is language that finds itself at home in the world of religions. The Army has long had a doctrine. It's had nearly 250 years to hone it, but it's a doctrine that was revamped in 2003 with a new emphasis on what they call the warrior ethos. And part of that emphasis was a change in slogan in 2006. Be all you can be ran through the 80s and 90s, so people of my age remember the Army, be all you can be, right? In 2001, it shifted to an army of one, an army of one, which maybe some of you remember from television, recruiting posters and whatnot. But that seemed to speak against the teamwork and cooperative element, and people found it dehumanizing. So in 2006, they changed it to Army Strong as part of this warrior ethos. And a revamped creed, right? In a 2011 Army article, the warrior ethos is said to, quote, define who we are and who we aspire to become. The principles of the ethos, quote, bind us to those who served before us. By embracing these time-honored principles, our soldiers will maintain this ethos for those who come after us. This article as a whole, and especially those lines, really resonate with the work of Danielle Herveau-Laguerre, which you might look up, religious studies scholar who wrote about religion as a chain of memory, wrote functionally about religion as, it is the thing that provides that chain of memory through not only sort of facts, but also mythic realities, values. So the Army's got its 7 core values, its warrior ethos, and as of 2003, as part of its warrior ethos programming, it has a revised soldier's creed. As I mentioned, the difference between the pre-2003 Soldier's Creed and the post-2003 Soldier's Creed is one that you can read up on Reddit. Very deep rabbit hole there if you're interested. We're going to pass it by. After the Army, which remember was founded June 14th, 1775, came the Navy. which was founded October 13th, 1775. It's also older than the nation, founded to fight in the Revolution, and it also has a creed. It's worth taking a look at the creeds. We won't do that here, but you can. Side by side, look up military creeds at a glance, and it'll take you to a really nice website. You'll get there, and they're worth reading. And the Navy also has core values: honor, courage, and commitment. The Navy's own page describing these core values, much like the Army's, is filled with words like decency, loyalty, ethics, morals, integrity, mindfulness, dignity. Next comes the Marine Corps, whose birthday is November 10th, 1775. Since 1834, the Marines have been a co-equal service within the Department of the Navy. So if you're a Marine, your military ID says Navy on it. That leads to a lot of jokes within service members. The last service founded before the Revolution. The Marine Corps is perhaps most intentional about celebrating its birthday. It is, of all the branches, most intentional about most aspects of its moral community. And we're going to set the Marines aside for now and return to them in a following subsequent lecture. They'll get their own lecture following this one's for a few reasons. But it is worth noting before we move on that the Marine Corps core values, Marine Corps is, as you see in the image, C-O-R-P-S. It means body, as in corporal. Or corpus, and then when I say core values, it's C-O-R-E as in central, but the Marine Corps' core values are the same as the Navy's: honor, courage, and commitment. So 1790 sees the founding of the United States Coast Guard, dedicated to maritime law enforcement. It's been part of the Department of Homeland Security since that own department was initiated and set up in 2003. Before then, it was the Coast Guard was part of the Department of Transportation, and before then it was under Treasury. The Coast Guard's core values, developed in 1993, are honor, respect, and devotion to duty. They too have a creed worth looking at. The United States Air Force was founded September 18th, 1947, when air patrols became more normalized, right, along with aeronautic technology and lots of development there. Pretty soon thereafter, you will see civilian air travel become normal in a way that led to a lot of things. The Army and the Navy, the Army, Navy, and Marines all have aviators. They all already had aviators. They all already had planes, but the Air Force focuses on aviation. Air Force culture is more corporate than the other branches, more sort of slickly professional. You can see that from their website if you take a look at it. As of 2010, the Air Force motto is aim high, fly, fight, win. And we'll look at the mottos in just a minute. You know, what the Air Force itself announced as, quote, an enduring statement of airmen's pride in their service. And they tried with the motto really explicitly to get at, quote, the core set of identity concepts that are shared by airmen. They did extensive research, much like market research, to find out what the Air Force means to those within it. So the sense of meaning, value, and purpose that is central to moral communities within and outside of your standard institutionalized religious bodies. This is what each of these core values is really aiming at. The Air Force was very professionally intentional about crafting that. The Air Force Chief of Staff, then Air Force Chief of Staff General Norton Schwartz, said, "We took the time to get this right." We took the time to try to get this right. And they really did. The Air Force core values were described by a previous Chief of Staff, General Michael Ryan, as, quote, a touchstone, a guide in our own conscience, to remind us of what we expect from ourselves. Those core values, according to the Air Force, quote, provide the moral framework for military activities. And they are for the Air Force: integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. And the Air Force's description of these values includes such words and phrases as faithfulness, respect, fundamental worth, ethical climate, moral code, honesty, trust, what is universal and unchanging, dedication, duty, fidelity, moral pillars, and on and on and on. This is the crafting of core values for the branches of the U.S. military is intentionally and self-understood to be an exercise in moral self-definition and the creation of moral communities. So, finally, in order of founding, we get the newest branch of the U.S. military, the United States Space Force, founded December 20th, 2019. It is an independent service under the Air Force. The Air Force has had a space command since 1982. But the United States Space Force is that command grown into an independent service, right? It is the smallest service and by far the newest. It hasn't had time to develop its own independent doctrine, but it did release the first installment of that doctrine and really made an effort. And you can look this up. It was released in August of 2020. And in that doctrine, it defines, which it calls the capstone, so you can look at it by that. In that doctrine, it defines space power as a distinct form of military power, and it describes the cornerstone traits of agility, innovation, and boldness, which it doesn't list as core values, but they seem to be functioning as the core values. And they're all they're said within this document to all be requiring the support of empowerment. So the virtue of empowerment may or may not be one of the core values. Empowerment undergirds agility, innovation, and boldness, though, as seen by it. So I might have marked empowerment up there. They may end up putting it in their official list when they come up with one. But agility, innovation, and boldness were cornerstone traits that were highlighted, but which, the doctrine itself begins with a recognition of its own preliminary status. It says we know we're new, right? The Army, the Navy, the Marines, they've had 250 years to work on their doctrines. Like, we're trying, we're working on it. This is a beginning, and it will grow. The doctrine's preface opens with this really romantically aspirational passage that I will read to you. Humanity has long been drawn to gaze upward and ponder the mystery of the heavens. We are defined by our hunger to explore the universe and our unending quest for knowledge of our place in the cosmos. This drive to push back the dark edges of the map and demystify our frontiers is not without conflict. Just as on land, on the seas, and in the sky, the great expanse beyond Earth is now contested. That's the opening of the preface, so that's a real emphatic by position statement, right? But gazing upward, pondering mysteries, questing for knowledge of our place in the cosmos, that's the human condition, and that's the first thing that the Space Force feels compelled to articulate. But very quickly, it's made clear that, Space Force will make that condition, that basic, fundamental, questing, romantic human condition, Space Force will make it safe, right? The success of these endeavors is only possible. This is the end of the preface from which that last quote came. This is the end of it. The success of those endeavors is only possible if we secure the peaceful use of space. So again, it could make an entire class. The development, really intentional. The development of the Space Force doctrine in some ways speaks to, as much as it speaks to this moral communities that each of the branches of service creates, and therefore to the center of American civil religion as it functions today. This doctrine articulated in 2020 really is useful in expressing the 21st century vision of America as a civil society, the human condition, and what the role of the nation is within it. Like, it speaks as much to our contemporary moment as it does to the branch of service that it's reflecting upon. You might take a look at it. It might be worth it. So that's the United States Space Force, and comic responses and visual consonance with Star Trek aside, if you've Space Force really seems poised to develop a strong and thorough mythos. It seems ready to do that, and I'd like to suggest that this kind of comic relief, the visual consonance on the left is hard to ignore, but the comic relief of Steve Carell and his new show, which I have to admit I've not seen, you can think of within the branches of the United States Armed Services, you can think of the Space Force as something like a new religious movement in the context of civil religion, right? And we do have a tendency to associate authenticity with age, right? And so the sort of Army, Navy, and Marines, pre-revolutionary, they get a certain cachet out of that, whereas the Space Force, it's new, it's a new religious movement in a way, like they have a hard time coming on the scene. So they do seem poised to develop a very strong and very thorough mythos, one commenting on our contemporary moment as much as on their force, so it's worth paying attention to. So the military stands at the center of American civil religion, and its 6 branches each form their own overlapping moral communities, right? Here, by way of review, are the core values, and I've gone ahead and put the mottos above the core values in italics. So Army strong. Army doesn't have an official motto. It's as much ad campaign as it is motto, right? Some services have a more dedicated connection to their motto. Marine Corps, top of the list among them was Semper Fidelis, right? Army strong on the left, Semper Fortis for the Navy, always strong. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Semper Paratus for the Coast Guard, always ready. And then you have aim high, fly, fight, win. And for the Space Force, Semper Supra, which means always above. So this just give you a sense, if you wanted to pause on this and kind of look at, there's a lot of overlapping. Honor, 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 honor. Honor shows up in all but the last two, and integrity, right? You can go with integrity. Semper Supra, Space Force does not seem to have something that directly correlates to honor or integrity, but boldness definitely gets the courage aspect in there. There are a great deal of overlap, and it's interesting to look at the core values that sit at the center of the Venn diagram of each armed services explicitly articulated core values. That might be worth doing. These are values that one might say, America shares, right? Whether or not we enact. So next we will take a closer look at the moral community of the Marine Corps.